In the wide,
You must listen, the
wind-worn
signs are
plains,
clear.
where the land
Trouble
stretched
rides on the
endlessly
next
beneath a
ridge.
bruised sky, the town of Dry Creek existed like a forgotten scar on the earth, a place where hope arrived rarely and left quickly, and where people learned early that survival mattered more than kindness. It was here that Eliza May Harper learned what it meant to be unwanted. From the day she could remember, whispers followed her like dust storms, low, cruel murmurs that clung to her clothes and hair no matter how far she walked. She was called plain, unlucky, a burden wrapped in skin and bone. Her mother had died birthing her, and in Dry Creek, that alone was enough to curse a child. Folks said Eliza carried death in her shadow, that any man foolish enough to tie his life to hers would regret it. So when she grew into a woman, tall, quiet, with eyes the color of rain-soaked, earth and hands rough from years of work, she found herself standing on the edge of society, seen but never chosen. By the time she turned 26, every woman her age had long been married, some twice over, while Eliza remained the girl men politely ignored and openly pitied. She worked harder than anyone, cooking, sewing, tending animals, cleaning houses, doing anything that earned her a few coins and a place to sleep. Yet no amount of effort softened the town's judgment. Dry Creek believed a woman's worth was measured by the ring on her finger, and Eliza wore nothing but rejection. The day her name was announced for the bride selection, the air itself seemed to recoil. In Dry Creek, unmarried women without family were placed on a list, an old, unspoken tradition meant to solve the problem of women who had no protection and no future. Ranchers, cowboys, widowers, and desperate men came from neighboring lands to choose a wife. It was supposed to be practical, not romantic, but even practicality had standards. When Eliza stepped forward that morning, dressed in a faded blue dress she had mended a dozen times, her shoulders straight, despite the weight pressing down on her chest, the crowd fell into an uneasy silence. Men shifted their feet. Some laughed under their breath. Others looked away entirely. One man muttered that he wouldn't take her even if she came with land. Another said she looked like trouble wrapped in sorrow. Each rejection struck her like a quiet blow, yet Eliza did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears only entertained cruel people. She stood there, breathing slowly, counting the seconds, reminding herself that survival had never depended on being loved. As one man after another declined, embarrassment curdled into something darker. Humiliation served publicly, deliberately. The town elders exchanged glances, uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. They believed this spectacle was necessary. A lesson perhaps, or simply entertainment. Eliza's hands trembled, but she clasped them tightly, nails digging into her palms to ground herself. She remembered her mother only through stories, how gentle she had been, how she believed kindness was strength, and wondered if that belief had been her downfall. Because in Dry Creek, kindness was seen as weakness, and Eliza had inherited it fully. When the final man stepped back and shook his head, declaring flatly that he would rather remain alone than marry that girl, a murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. It was over. The bride every man rejected stood alone under the open sky, stripped not of clothes but of dignity. That was when she noticed him, not among the crowd, but apart from it, leaning against the fence as if he hadn't planned to be there at all. The cowboy was older than most, his face etched with lines carved by sun and solitude. His hat was pulled low, shadowing eyes that watched quietly, thoughtfully. He did not laugh. He did not turn away. He simply observed, as though seeing something the others could not. His name was Caleb Stone, and loneliness clung to him like the dust on his boots. He had come to Dry Creek only to sell cattle and leave, uninterested in the town's customs or cruelty. Years earlier, he had buried the woman he loved, and with her any belief that happiness was meant for him. Since then, his ranch had become his world, wide, silent, demanding, but honest. He trusted horses more than people, and silence more than promises. Caleb had not intended to choose a bride. He didn't believe a wife could be selected like livestock, and the idea repulsed him. But when he saw Eliza standing there, rejected by every man who claimed to be seeking a partner, Something stirred deep in his chest, an old, aching recognition. He saw not a cursed woman, but someone who knew what it meant to endure. He recognized the way she held herself, not begging, not bitter, just tired. And in that moment, he understood that loneliness came in many forms, and hers mirrored his own. The crowd's cruelty grated on him, and without fully knowing why, he pushed himself away from the fence and stepped forward. The sound of his boots against the dirt cut through the murmurs. Heads turned. Whispers spread. When Caleb stopped beside Eliza, she barely dared to look at him, convinced this was another joke, another humiliation waiting to strike. The elder cleared his throat, confused. Caleb lifted his head, his voice steady but firm, and said the words that would change both their lives forever. "I'll take her." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Someone laughed in disbelief. Another asked if he was serious. Caleb didn't waver. He repeated himself, louder this time, making sure everyone heard.
"I'll take her."
"If she's willing." All eyes turned to Eliza, whose heart thundered so violently she thought she might collapse. No one had ever asked what she wanted, not once. She looked up at Caleb then, really looked at him, and saw no mockery in his eyes, only resolve and something, dangerously close to respect. Eliza nodded, because she had learned that hesitation invited regret, and because somewhere deep inside her, a fragile spark of hope flickered to life. The crowd erupted, not in celebration but in confusion and judgment. People whispered that Caleb must be desperate, that he would regret it, that Eliza would ruin him, as she had supposedly ruined everyone else. But Caleb ignored them all. He offered Eliza his arm, not possessively, not proudly, just as a simple gesture of partnership. She hesitated only a moment before accepting. Her hand felt small and uncertain against his strong forearm. Yet for the first time in her life, she did not feel like something being dragged forward against her will. As they walked away, Eliza knew her life had crossed an invisible line. She did not know if happiness waited on the other side, or merely a different kind of struggle. But she also knew this: someone had finally chosen her, not out of obligation, not out of pity, but because he saw something worth standing up for. And as the wind swept across the plains, carrying dust and whispers behind them, Eliza allowed herself one dangerous thought, that maybe rejection had not been the end of her story, but the beginning. The journey away from Dry Creek began without ceremony, as though the land itself wished to erase what had happened there. Eliza rode beside Caleb in the wagon, her small bundle of belongings tucked at her feet, the town shrinking behind them until it became nothing more than a blur of dust and memory. She did not look back. Every mile carried her farther from a life defined by rejection, yet the uncertainty ahead pressed on her chest just as heavily. Caleb did not speak much, and strangely, she was grateful for the silence. It gave her room to breathe, to think, to wonder whether this choice, this sudden turn of her fate, would save her or break her in new ways. She had learned not to expect kindness to last, and though Caleb's voice had been steady and sincere when he chose her, trust did not come easily to a woman who had spent her life being cast aside. Caleb's ranch lay beyond a stretch of rugged hills, tucked into a valley where the wind moved softer and the grass grew, stubborn and thick. It was not grand, but it was solid, weathered wood, a sturdy barn, fencing repaired by patient hands. To Eliza, it felt vast and intimidating, not because of its size, but because it represented permanence. This was not a place people passed through. This was a place they stayed. As Caleb helped her down from the wagon, he spoke carefully, as if each word mattered. He told her there would be no demands placed on her, no expectations beyond honesty and effort. He said she would have her own room, her own space, and time to decide what kind of life she wanted there. No man had ever offered her choice before, and it left her disoriented, unsure how to respond. She nodded quietly, absorbing the weight of it all. The first weeks were awkward, marked by polite distance and unspoken questions. Eliza rose early, as she always had, instinctively taking on chores, cooking simple meals, cleaning, tending the garden plot near the house. Caleb noticed but did not command her. And when he thanked her, it was without ownership in his tone. At night, Eliza lay awake listening to the sounds of the ranch, the creak of wood, the distant snort of horses, the wind brushing against the walls, and wondered if this calm was real or merely the pause before another storm. She half expected Caleb to change, to reveal bitterness or cruelty, but day after day he remained the same, quiet, fair, steady as the land he worked. Slowly trust began to form, not through grand gestures, but through consistency. Caleb never raised his voice. He never spoke down to her. When Eliza burned a meal one evening, expecting criticism, he simply ate it anyway and said it reminded him that perfection wasn't necessary for survival. The words lodged deep in her chest. No one had ever allowed her to be imperfect without punishment. She began to speak more tentatively at first, sharing pieces of her past, the houses she had cleaned, the nights she had slept hungry, the way people looked at her as if she were already a disappointment before she spoke. Caleb listened, really listened, without interrupting or trying to fix her pain. And when he finally spoke, he told her about his wife, lost years ago to illness, and how loneliness had hollowed him out until the ranch was the only thing keeping him anchored to the world. In each other's stories, they found reflections of their own wounds. But peace rarely goes unchallenged. Word traveled fast across the plains, and soon whispers from Dry Creek reached neighboring towns. People said Caleb had made a foolish choice, that Eliza was cursed, that misfortune would follow her wherever she went. Supplies became harder to acquire. A neighboring rancher withdrew a trade agreement without explanation. One night, a fence was found damaged, livestock scattered. Eliza overheard two men in town speaking cruelly about her, blaming her for every small trouble that touched Caleb's land. Guilt wrapped around her like a noose. She confronted Caleb, telling him she would leave if she was bringing him harm, her voice shaking as she spoke the words she had practiced her whole life. He stopped what he was doing, looked at her with quiet intensity, and said something she would never forget, that hardship had existed long before she arrived, and choosing her had been the one decision he did not regret. That was the moment something shifted. Eliza realized that Caleb was not rescuing her, and she was not ruining him. They were standing together against a world that had failed them both. She worked harder than ever, not to earn her place, but because she wanted to protect what they were building. She learned the rhythms of the ranch, helped with the animals, and discovered a strength she hadn't known she possessed. Caleb, in turn, began to smile more, to hum while working, to speak of future plans, rather than merely surviving the present. The ranch slowly transformed, not through wealth or luck, but through shared labor and mutual respect. When winter came harsh and unforgiving, it tested them both. A storm unlike any in years swept through the valley, trapping them inside for days. Supplies dwindled, fear crept in during the long nights. It was then, in the quiet glow of lantern light, that Caleb finally admitted how afraid he had been to choose happiness again, how he had stepped forward in Dry Creek not because he was brave, but because he was tired of being alone. Eliza confessed her deepest fear, that she was unlovable, that one day he would see what everyone else claimed to see and turn away. Caleb took her hands then, rough palms warm against hers, and told her that love was not about perfection or approval, but about choosing each other every day, especially when it was hard. When spring arrived, the land bloomed as if in answer to their perseverance. Crops grew strong. The animals thrived. Neighbors who had doubted began to soften, drawn by the undeniable proof that the ranch and the woman beside Caleb were not cursed but resilient. The bride every man had rejected became a woman respected, admired even, not because she sought validation, but because she stood firmly in her worth. And the lonely cowboy who had stepped forward found that love, when built slowly and honestly, was stronger than the fear that once kept him isolated. Eliza never forgot Dry Creek, but it no longer defined her. She understood now that rejection had never meant she was unworthy. It only meant she had been waiting for the right place, the right person, the right moment to be seen. And as she stood beside Caleb, watching the sun rise over land they had claimed together, She knew that being chosen was powerful, but choosing herself had been the greatest victory of all. And if this story touched something in you, if you've ever felt rejected, overlooked, or convinced you were meant to walk alone, remember Eliza and Caleb. Remember that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is step forward when the world steps back. Subscribe to this channel for more powerful stories of resilience, love, and second chances, because the next story might just remind you that your moment to be chosen is closer than you think.